In this video, we're going to walk through all of the steps you need to get started with setting up your podcast on Castos and optionally integrating it into your WordPress site via Seriously Simple Podcasting. We'll walk through creating your first Castos account, setting up your first podcast there, publishing your first episode, assuming that you've recorded and edited the audio, configuring your RSS feed, and then optionally integrating with your WordPress site if you would like and if you have a WordPress site. And at the end, we'll have time for questions and answers. So at this point, let's dive into creating our first Castos account. Here from the Castos homepage, castos.com, we can start our 14-day free trial. All we ask for here is your name, email address, and password to create an account. Once you've registered an account, we ask you if you'll be managing your content via the Castos dashboard or if you'll be taking advantage of our WordPress integration and Seriously Simple Podcasting. As we say here, you can change this later, but for now, let's go ahead and set up as we'll be using this directly in Castos and not in WordPress. We'll cover the WordPress option later. If you have an existing podcast you're moving from another platform, you can automatically import that by placing your RSS feed here. Once you've pasted your podcast RSS feed in this field, click the import button and it will automatically bring all of the episodes and media files over into your Castos account automatically. You'll get an email notification when this process is complete, and it usually takes a couple of hours max. For this purpose, since we don't have a podcast we're already importing, we'll say no thanks. Here we're asked for the name of our first podcast. This is really the name of your podcast. So for us here at Castos, the name of our podcast is Audience. So I'll put that in here. So with this, we've created our first podcast. And again, a podcast is kind of the container and the group of episodes. But let's go ahead and publish our first episode now. So let's say things like creating a title. So episode 1, let's do my Star Wars one, A New Hope. Right, for all you Star Wars fan out there. And we'll give something cheeky about Luke may be our last hope. No, there is another. Cool, and then we'll upload a media file. So again, we've already recorded and edited our first episode MP3 file. We have guidance for how to encode MP3 files in our help docs, and we'll link to that in the email after this as well. But let's go ahead and upload this file here. And this file is uploading depending on your internet speed. This may take, a couple seconds to a few minutes. And then if you have things like keywords while the file is uploading, you can enter this here. Podcast, marketing, social media. Well, these are keywords that will be entered into the RSS feed to make my podcast more discoverable. I'm not using series and episode numbers here, but you certainly could if you'd like. And this will just be an integer, a number here, like series number 1, episode number, what do we call this? Episode number 4. Episode type is the last field here. And this is set as full for normal episodes, but if you have a trailer or a bonus episode, as iOS 11 came out some time ago now, it introduced these different types of files, or these different types of episodes. You can select these here if you'd like. But we'll leave ours as full, which is the default, so you don't have to pick anything. If you have an episode-specific image, you can pick that and upload it here, but we're going to use the standard image that we're going to set up in our RSS feed here in just a minute. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and publish my first episode now because I want to be able to continue moving on with creating my RSS feed, which is the next step. Okay, great. Episode added. I can see it here in my list of episodes for this podcast. Great. So the next thing is if I come over here and hover, it will say that I have some things I need to do before my podcast feed and my public pages for my podcast can be set up. So it says go to the podcast settings area. So I'll do that now. And we need to give our podcast a little more information. So we gave it a title at the beginning, if you remember. So we gave it the title of the podcast is Audience, and the description we need to give now We'll go ahead and upload our cover image. Number of episodes in our feed. At Castos, we default this to 25. I think that's a pretty good place to start. And then categories. And this really helps make your podcast discoverable. So you want to think about your categories a bit strategically to say your primary category is probably kind of obvious. You know, for us, we want it to be in like technology or in marketing because our podcast is a podcast about podcasting. But if your show is about gardening, then you want to pick the proper category that that kind of reflects that. So, you know, maybe yours would be something like down here, Homes and Garden, if your podcast is about gardening. Our podcast being about podcasting, we want to have it be primarily in the technology space first, maybe the second one being business and marketing, and the third one being something maybe a little bit different. And you'll notice I'm picking really different categories here, and the idea is that you want to kind of surround the topic of your podcast in areas where you think different types of people with slightly different interests might be going to look for podcasts that they might find interesting, that they might find your show interesting. Okay, so that's it. We already populate all of these fields automatically, so you don't need to do anything else there unless you want to. Coming down to the web page settings tab here, if you want to configure anything about this, you certainly can. Since this is already taken by our real podcast, I'll give this a title of audience test, so I don't try, otherwise I would get an error here. We're not using a custom domain, but if you've come with your own custom domain, say you have myawesomepodcast.com that you've bought from a domain registrar, you can certainly come in here, drop that URL in here, and then we have a help doc that walks through exactly how to set up to point your public pages that we create at Castos to your domain. So instead of a URL like this, audiencetest.castos.com, your website for your podcast could be myawesomepodcast.com, and it would be all based right on the Castos platform, but it's kind of white labeled to your own domain. So again, it's optional, but it's a really nice touch to give your podcast a real nice brand and identity without going to the trouble of, you know, if you don't have a WordPress site set up for your podcast, you just need a place to host your files and have a place for people to go. We provide that for everybody. Alternatively, if you don't want your podcast to be visible to the public, we offer the option to turn your podcast pages off. So again, we have this audiencetest.castos.com, shows a list of all the episodes and a way for people to subscribe and see your RSS feed. If you don't want people to be able to see that, say you have an internal podcast for your company, or you have a small community that you want to control access to your podcast content, you can turn this off here. Looking at branding, we give an option to set the kind of accent color on your podcast pages here, as well as social media contacts here. And I'll show you in just a minute what this looks like. We'll go ahead and save our podcast details for now, and then we'll go look at our Castos public pages to give more context around what this color picker and Instagram social media icons are like. Okay, great. Now let's go take a look at our Castos public pages. Okay, great. So this is the episode for episode 4, A New Hope, like we mentioned, and so these are kind of the show notes that we created, and then people, if they land on this individual episode page, can go back and look at your podcast's kind of main page, and this is the color that I mentioned. These two colors are kind of tied together. We bring over the podcast cover image that you uploaded, and then if you have social media links, you can put those in here. So we'll go ahead and do that now so you can see what that looks like. We'll go back to the podcast settings area and the web page settings, and let's just configure a little bit here. We're going to try to use a red color that's kind of similar to the red we used. So we'll say Instagram.com, Facebook.com, Twitter.com, YouTube.com. Of course, yours will be different than this, but this is just to give you an idea of where these social icons will be for people to connect with you on social media. And we'll go ahead and save this. And then once we refresh our podcast page here, we should see that change come through. Great. So this is really branded nicely now with our image and then the color scheme that we have for this podcast. And then below that, you see the list of episodes. And if you have, and then people can subscribe. So let's go ahead and set up the subscribe links now back on your Castos dashboard, again in that podcast settings area. And you can do all this at once, certainly if you'd like. You will have a list of places that you probably should submit your podcast to. The first three here are the really big ones: Pocket Casts and Castro. Both of these pull from Apple Podcast a couple days after your podcast is live there. But we'll go ahead and say, let's go ahead and get these few things in here just to show you what this looks like. If you need any help, we have documentation linked in the Learn More links to the right of each of these fields. But for now, just to show you what this looks like, we'll go ahead and put these kind of placeholder values in here and hit save. And again, we'll come back to our podcast homepage here, and the subscribe button now has links to these places as well. Super cool. Okay, so now you've created your Castos account, set up your first podcast, published your first episode, and configured your RSS feed. From here, the last step really to get your podcast live and into the world is to submit your RSS feed to podcast directories like Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Google Play, Overcast, Podcast, all these, right? And so we have a really nice blog post that we can link to that has all of the most popular directories that you want to submit your podcast to. But if you're using Castos as the only place where you manage your podcast, this is the RSS feed that you want to use to submit to those directories. So you can kind of right-click here, copy this, or highlight it, and hit Control or Command-C on your keyboard to copy this, and then you go submit these to the proper podcasting directories. You can take a look at the list of all of the podcasts. Again, with Castos, you can have as many different podcasts as you want, each with their own separate podcast page, their separate podcast RSS feed. And so if you want to create another podcast, you can here by clicking this button, and it follows the exact same process as we did creating the first one. Once you've set up your podcast and you're ready to kind of go, you can upgrade your account to one of our paid plans to make sure your podcast stays live. And that's really the whole process of setting up your podcast. From creating an account, we created our first podcast, we published our first episode, we configured our podcast pages on Castos, and we finished setting up our RSS feed. So everything is done there. It took us, 5 minutes or so. Now we're going to go and kind of start over and go into WordPress and work through the whole process of setting up your podcast account on Castos, connecting it to your WordPress site, and then creating our podcast and our feed and publishing our first episode inside WordPress. So let's go do that now. Okay, once again, starting from kind of scratch here, we're starting from the Castos.com homepage. We'll start our free trial. This would be the process of getting started with Castos if you're a WordPress user. So we covered the situation of if you're just a Castos user and you're not using a WordPress site. If you already have a WordPress site and you want to integrate your podcast and your hosting account into WordPress, this would be the process you'll follow. So we'll create our account just as we did before. And once you've created your account, we'll come to this page again where we ask you if you're going to manage your podcast content through the Castos dashboard or through your WordPress site. Since we're using it through our WordPress site, we'll select this option, give our podcast a name, just like before, and we're taken to this place where we're going to copy our API key, which is this big long number here. Just highlight the whole thing, copy it, and then we'll head back to our WordPress site to set things up there. So if you haven't already, we'll start by installing the Seriously Simple Podcasting plugin. From your WordPress dashboard, plugins, and then add new. If you type in podcast and the keyword here, Seriously Simple Podcasting is right here. Once that's installed, we'll go ahead and activate the plugin. Okay, great. And then it creates this podcast area here in your WordPress dashboard. We'll come over here and in the settings area, in the hosting tab here, we'll go ahead and connect to the hosting account we just set up on the Castos dashboard. So our email address was Craig plus, and enter our API key. Click Validate Credentials. It'll take just a second. Okay, credentials valid, that's good, and we'll hit Save. At this point, your WordPress site is connected to the Castos account you just set up. So all you have to do is create your podcast episodes here in your WordPress site, and they automatically get synced over to your Castos dashboard. So we'll go ahead and do that now for our first podcast episode. So under the podcast tab, we'll say Add New Episode. And okay. Is that right? Is that the phrase? There can only be two Sith, right? There's the master and the apprentice. Okay, so we've done this. This obviously your show notes will be much longer, but this is just kind of to show what this is all about. So we have a title for the episode. We have the show notes or the description, and then we'll come down here and upload a file for this episode. A little blue progress bar up here while the file is uploading. If you want to add more show notes during this time, you certainly can. Apprentice, is that right? Oh, close. Okay, and then you can do things over here like if you want to schedule this in the future, you certainly can. Everybody knows kind of how WordPress works. Tags in WordPress translate to keywords for your podcast and your RSS feed. So if you want to have keyword 1 and keyword 2, you certainly can. That's probably good for SEO and discoverability. We'll talk about series in just a minute, but while we're waiting for this podcast to upload, in short, series is the nomenclature, the wording that we use within Series Simple Podcasting to talk about multiple separate podcasts. So you could be like a podcast network and have different podcasts for each of your brands or each of your sports teams that you follow or something like that. So we'll talk about series here in a bit and how to create them and how to assign episodes to different series. Wanted to walk through the process of kind of creating a regular podcast, and then we'll talk about what series are here in just a bit. Okay, so we'll go ahead and publish this here in WordPress. Great, so this is done, and so we'll click on this to go take a look at this episode. We use a really kind of basic WordPress setup here for our test site, but this should give you an idea of kind of what this all looks like. Okay, great, so this looks great. Have the play in new window and the subscribe links, that's cool. We can go ahead and play this and see that the file is playing, that's great. And this is, on your WordPress site. So this is directly in the domain and the space that you control entirely. We are big fans of kind of owning your own turf for all of your content, which is a big reason why we have the WordPress integration. We want you to have kind of full control over all of your digital assets. We're pretty big fans of that. And having your podcast on your WordPress site is a great way to do that. So there's a few other things I want to walk through before we get to series in terms of setting up your podcast on your WordPress site. So we mentioned that you publish your episodes here in the podcast area predominantly. That's just kind of by default. You don't have to. You can publish podcast episodes anywhere you want. So in the regular blog posts area, or say you're a church website and you have a custom post type of sermons, it would show up here, and you could select sermons as the area you want to publish your podcast episodes. Totally fine. All this will do is include the functionality of Seriously Simple Podcasting into those post types. So here we're including it in the post area. But again, if you have sermons as a post type, it would include that podcast episode details meta box where we uploaded the file previously in that sermons post type. So again, posts is by default the place that you publish podcast episodes, but if you want to include them in the regular blog post area or in another custom post type, you certainly can. The next setting is where we want to show the media player. I like to show it everywhere. I think it's just nice and it's convenient for your listeners. A lot of people will come to, mysite.com/podcast and just want to land on that page and play an episode right from there. They won't want to have to click through to the individual episode pages. And doing this and showing on the excerpt will give them that option. Showing on the full content will be in the whole kind of episode post. The media player will show. And this embed excerpt, you can take and create an iframe for the entire post to place that post on like another website. And if you do that with this option, the media player will show on that as well. So that's cool. We give you the option to display the player either above the content or below. We also have a short code for placing the media player within the post contents itself somewhere. So it's not above, it's not below, it's after the first paragraph or something. So we give you that option. You can set whether the media player is visible to everyone or only to logged in users. I usually leave this to everybody. The iOS 11 fields, like we mentioned before, are these things like series number and episode number, as well as episode type. So you can turn these on if you would like. Enabling the player metadata, I will go back to... So going back to the episode we just published, the metadata is these items down here, as well as the subscribe links. And so you can turn these off if you want to have a more clean look. I like to turn them on because it makes for a better experience for listeners to find things like subscribe links or to download the file or play it in a new window if you would like. So that's what this metadata setting is all about. You can also select which type of player you want to show. The HTML5 player is this really nice kind of full-featured player that we are seeing here. This is really beautiful, I think, and this is the kind of the most popular one. But if you have a bunch of players on a page or in a small area, you might want to choose for a more compact player, and we give you that option here. Speaking of the HTML5 player, you can configure the colors of the background, the progress bar, and the progress meter, I guess, in that player, and the image that we have associated with the player automatically propagates from the podcast settings area over into the front end of the player here. So that happens automatically. But if you want to configure the colors, you certainly can doing that here. So of course we'll click save if we've changed any of these settings. And the next thing I want to look at is the feed for this podcast. So we talked through series before, and I promise we'll get into that in just a minute. But before, I think it's important to talk through setting up your podcast RSS feed in WordPress, and we'll do that now. So we have things like the title of our podcast. So in previously we called it audience, but now we'll call it Getting Started with Castos. The subtitle and the author field here, we set categories just like we did before, and you can set the primary and the secondary category. So within arts, we might want to talk about performing arts, and within, education, we might want to be talking about how to. All right, so we give you the option to set all of those top level and subcategories here. In the description area, again, describe what your podcast is all about. Upload your cover image. This pulls from the media area of your WordPress site if you already have the file uploaded. If not, you can upload a new one. Pick it from here. So we'll go ahead and pick the audience cover image. Owner name, let's see, that's me. My email address. Copyright information, 2020. If you want to mark the podcast as explicit, you can do this here. This is for the podcast as a whole. On an individual episode basis, you can also mark it as explicit. If your podcast is done and you're not going to be adding any more episodes to it in the future, you can mark it as complete as well. The show type, we talked about this before. If it's episodic, or serial, these are those iOS 11 tags. You can do that. Media file prefix. This is for using third-party analytics tools like Chartable or Podtrack. If you are using one of those, they will give you a prefix that looks a lot like this, and you'll want to insert this here, and this will place this prefix before all of the media file URLs for your podcast in your feed. So when people go to download your episode, it gets passed through this service to collect information about listenership for your show. Definitely not mandatory, but if you're using those, this is where you would insert it. We can choose for the podcast feed if the episode description is just the excerpt from your post or the full post content. Kind of different in WordPress than in Castos. Sometimes we might have really long blog posts that go along with each episode. And so we give you the option, again, here to say, yes, I want to include all of that content in my RSS feed, or no, I want to include just a snippet about what the episode is about. Again, either way, it's up to you, but we give you that option. We're big on options here at Castos, and this is another kind of example of that. Again, talking about having a lot or very long content, if you have hundreds of podcast episodes, and maybe you're doing something like transcribing all of the episodes to where each blog post is really, really long for each episode, you can do what we call turbocharge your feed, which is where it gives the full contents for the last 5 or 10 episodes, but then truncates that down to a shorter version of the contents that you set up here that you were going to include in the feed for the older ones. The idea here is that a lot of podcasts, a lot of listenership to podcasts happen with the most recent episodes. Very few people go back and listen to all of your previous episodes that are, say, older than a month old. And so we feel like in order to keep a feed kind of viable and fast and valid for the podcasting directories, we can truncate some of the older descriptions while for the older episodes, but keeping the full description for the newer ones. So that's an option here if you need to. If you don't need to, just leave this off. If you ever are going to move your WordPress site or move your feed from WordPress to, say you want to move your feed to Castos, you would use this area here. So you would enable this field and then put a new feed URL in here. Please be very, very, very careful doing this. If you don't know what you're doing, this will break your podcast. If you start directing your podcast feed to a URL that's not a real feed and doesn't have the information about your podcast in it. So if you don't know what you're doing, please reach out to us, hello@castos.com. We'll walk you through the whole process. We have some really great help docs in our support area about this as well. But just to know that if you're moving your podcast site or URL, or if you're moving from WordPress to a platform like Castos to manage your feed, this is where you would put it in, and this would be like that myshow.castos.com/feed URL here. The last thing here is the subscribe buttons that we saw over on the player. So we automatically generated this for Spotify already, and we can do this for Stitcher and Google.com. So again, these are just placeholders that we just wanted to show you kind of what this looks like. And if you wanted to put your feed, this is what your feed URL will look like. So we'll save all of these, and we made a couple of changes here, but just wanted to show you kind of what all of the feed options are like in Seriously Simple Podcasting for your WordPress site. So the first thing is we'll come over here and show you what those additional subscribe buttons look like. Great. Remember, we updated our image here, so that shows in the player. And so that all looks great here on the front end of WordPress to see kind of what your site visitors would see. And then back in the dashboard, we can view our feed if you'd like to see kind of what this looks like. Again, you will never see this really. This feed URL is just for submitting to podcast directories like Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify. You do not need this feed URL to send to customers or to send to listeners. This is the URL that most listeners will come to, mysite.com/podcast. And this is kind of a page that we build automatically through the plugin that shows a list of all the episodes for your podcast. Okay, great. So back in WordPress, we're going to talk through one last thing, and that is the series functionality. So if you want to create multiple podcasts on a single WordPress site, you certainly can. All of those can be hosted in the same Castos account. And so we'll go through the process of setting up a new series now and publishing an episode to it. So we'll call this My First Series and hit save. And you see that this is created over here. It gives you the feed URL for that series. And so now let's go ahead and publish an episode to that series. And this is very much the same. As before, with the exception of in the document area, if you're using Gutenberg, you'll want to select this series that you just created as the place that this episode gets categorized under. Okay, so we'll upload this file. And once the file is finished uploading, we will take and go ahead and publish this episode. Okay, so now we'll come back to the settings area in the feeds to look at our feeds. You'll notice that we have the default feed, which is created automatically when the plugin is installed. We also have our first series feed in here. And so we need to give this a title. So we'll call it the same thing. Author is me. We'll leave these all the same. All of this is okay for me. And we'll go ahead and save. A lot of this inherits things from the default feed, which is nice. And then you can go in and change any of those that you'd like. And if we want to view this feed, we can. And we see this is the name. And this is the image that we saw on that previous screen. And then this has just the one episode. So this website is kind of our test site. It has a bunch of episodes on it, but we just created this series. This My First Series or podcast, and it only has this one episode that we just published. So that's setting up series and Serious Simple Podcasting. Now let's go back to Castos and see what we have here. And here in our Castos account, we can see that we created the one episode under the default podcast that's created automatically by Serious Simple Podcasting, and then we created our first series, which also has this one episode. So this information is synced automatically from your WordPress site to your Castos dashboard, both for series and for your default podcast. Cool.